This podcast was made on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, the Woiwurrung and the Bunurong. We'd like to pay respects to their elders, past and present, and emerging. From the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences at the University of Melbourne, this is PsychTalks.
Welcome back. Today we have a special bonus episode recorded during a visit from one of psychology's most influential thinkers. We're joined by Professor Mahzarin Banaji from Harvard University, whose work has fundamentally reshaped how we understand bias, fairness, and the role of non-conscious processes in human behaviour.
Mahzarin is visiting Melbourne as a Miegunyah Distinguished Visiting Fellow, where she delivered a public lecture titled Blind Spot: Hidden Biases in Humans and Machines. In her work, she shows how bias can shape judgments outside conscious awareness, in both people and artificial intelligence. Today we'll be talking about bias in people and our machines and explore how psychological science can help us think more clearly about ourselves and our technologies. So Mahzarin, welcome to PsychTalks. How are you enjoying Melbourne?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. How can one not enjoy Melbourne might be the answer. It has been fabulous. This is such a vibrant city. And I just read that the median age of the city is 28 to 30 years, which puts me in a place that feels very similar to a campus, a whole city of very young people. So it's nice to be an invisible old relic in a city of lots of exciting things happening. And I will say that I've eaten more gelato here than I've eaten in many years. So thank you for having me, and I'm having a wonderful time.
Speaking of feeling old, we were just reminiscing that the last time I think I saw you was 23 years ago at summer school, which is the SPSP summer school in Boulder, Colorado. And I was in your group as a bright-eyed finishing PhD student learning about implicit bias, which is what we're going to talk about today.
But you were a teenager then, weren't you?
Yeah, I was about 4, I think, and Mahzarin was about 5.
And I was about
very,
8.
very young.
I was 8.
Such prodigies we have here.
Prodigies. But you've spent decades studying implicit bias. Before we delve into some details, for our listeners who might not kind of be fully across the definition of what implicit bias is, could you give us just a quick, I know it's not necessarily a topic that lends itself to a quick definition, but just so listeners can get in their heads what we're talking about today?
Oh, sure. So the best way to think about implicit bias is that it is a very ordinary part of human cognition. Most people today who do any work in psychology do understand that large parts of how we think and what we think happen outside our conscious awareness. Okay. Now, we don't know that. There's this very sweet little parable that goes something like this. There are these 2 little fish who are swimming along in the ocean, and this older fish passes them by going in the opposite direction, and he says to them, "So boys, how's the water this morning?" And the 2 little fish keep swimming for a little while, and then one turns to the other and says, "What the hell is water?" And this has so many little things embedded in it. First of all, that, what's familiar to us is something we're quite unaware of. But also that if you're a fish in the water, you have no idea that there's a thing called land. And I think that's the state of our minds. We only know what it feels like to have conscious awareness. That's 100% of our daily experience. And yet, our science has taught us that most of what we do is happening outside of conscious awareness. So you take that idea, and all we did is applied it to how human beings make decisions about the most significant other object in their universe, and that is other humans. And we show that people make choices and decisions and selections that unconsciously rely on attributes of a person that they have no clue they're using in their decisions. And so they're biased, but they're not consciously biased. They're implicitly or unconsciously biased.
You make it sound like a small, modest discovery, but it's obviously this huge, impactful contribution you made. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of your interest in the topic? So we're talking about the early 90s, I think, aren't we, when you're having these ideas?
Yeah.
Can you say a bit about how it all unfolded and how Project Implicit came to be?
Oh, yeah. It's actually the late 80s. So I had no intention of studying the topic of bias. I had no interest in it. I'd never thought about it. Words like a person's height and weight and gender and religion and nationality were completely uninteresting to me. I was a student of human memory. That's what I did all through graduate school. I looked at how the self operates as an information processing system. I looked at, in my dissertation work, I was studying the influence of emotion on memory. And so my first job, which was at Yale, had a little a journal club that met every Friday. And Bob Crowder, who was a memory, a giant in the field of auditory memory work, and I would run this journal club, and we presented papers we were interested in. And I happened to present a paper that was done by this genius, Larry Jacoby, who had found that if you show people information on day one, like names pulled out of a phone book, and then they go away for a couple of days and you bring them back to the lab and you show them the same names that they've seen before, but mixed in were names they had never seen before. And also some names of famous people, like past presidents and artists and athletes and so on. And the job of the subject was very simple. Read each name and tell me, is this the name of a famous person or not? So using simple signal detection analyses, if you correctly identified a famous person as a famous person, that would be a hit. But what he was interested in were false alarms. When do you mistakenly believe that somebody is famous who isn't famous? And the theory was that if implicit memory operates, a name you've read 2 days ago, like Sebastian Weisdorf, that should feel familiar 2 days later. But you can't tell, is Sebastian Weisdorf familiar because I saw the name 48 hours ago? Or is he that Canadian hockey player or something? So under those conditions of uncertainty, you make a mistake. And the mistake is to wrongly identify Weisdorf as famous when, in fact, he's not famous. Nice demonstration that implicit memory operates, that perceptual fluency is the underlying cause of it. I presented this paper and there was a bunch of interest in it. And I thought, since I'm interested in memory, I'll just replicate this result and then move on and do other things on implicit memory. Because that was the big revolution. The idea that one could remember things, not in the traditional conscious way. If you asked me, what did you have for breakfast? I may not be able to tell you, but you give me an indirect test and I will respond faster to, scrambled eggs if that's what I had or whatever. So that was the interest. And all I did is I wrote to Larry Jacoby and I said, in those days, you wrote a little postcard and you said, "Dear Dr. Jacoby, would you please send me your materials?" And then you waited every day and in your mailbox would arrive a big fat manila envelope. People did that. They sent stuff. They sent their papers. They sent stimuli. And so I got such a fat packet. And I remember opening it and looking at the materials. And I called him up and I said, "You only sent me half your stimuli. They're all male names." And he said, "Well, why would I have included female names? Women aren't famous." So, and I remember in 1989 thinking that he was right. For the experiment, which was on memory, there was no need to have all, and it's true. It would have been incredibly difficult to match male and female names on fame and the non-famous ones and the famous ones. But I don't know why I did this, and this may be itself worth talking about. I spent an entire summer generating equivalent female names for every famous and non-famous male. For every Sebastian Weisdorf, I came up with a Stephanie Weisdorf. And my family remembers this very well because whoever came home, in those days, there was no internet. So I was just asking people for names of, famous people. Anyway, I did that study not expecting to see anything other than the same effect. And we didn't. Female names did not become famous overnight in the same way as male names did. And so I thought, again, because in that moment, the idea that this is happening unconsciously was simply not there. And so I started to quiz the subjects in every experiment I was running. And I would say, "So what did you use to make your decision?" not one of the 400 or so subjects I ran said gender. So then I would ask them, I would say, do you think the gender of the name mattered? And they would look horrified and say, of course not. I'm not a sexist. That's when some light bulb went off. And I decided, and this was kind of late I'd already been at Yale for 3 or 4 years. And I decided to just drop doing my work on human memory because I thought this was just stunning that people were making decisions being affected by the gender of the name, and they were clueless. And I knew they were not lying when they said, I'm not using gender. They were genuinely feeling like they had not done that. So that was what got it off the ground. I'm sorry, the story is a little long, but
fascinating.
Yeah, it wasn't planned. Yeah.
And then moving on from those memory tasks, one of the most common tests for measuring implicit bias is the implicit association test, which you've had a long history with. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is and what it measures and how that came about?
So my colleague Tony Greenwald and I wrote a paper in that appeared in 95, but it was written a little bit earlier. It went through many rounds. In which the last paragraph says, all this is great. We can tell you that we think that there's something interesting here, but the field awaits a method, that there is no. I mean, the FAME study was nice, but it wasn't something we could use to do studies on all. We needed something that was a more general method. And we were using established methods for studying automatic forms of memory, like semantic priming. So in semantic priming, a word flashes very quickly on a screen. Following that word, a second word appears. And you're, as a subject, supposed to respond to the second word on, say something like, is this a word or not a word? Is this a good word or a bad word? And what we know is that the previous word has a great deal of influence. So if the first word is king and the second word is queen, you're much faster to say that queen is a word than if the first word were bread or something unrelated. We were using those methods and they were wonderful, but each subject had to produce 900 trials in an hour. And the effect sizes would be on the order of 8 to 10 millisecond differences. I even gave a talk at CESP one year in which, this is the Society for Experimental Social Psychology meeting, in which I titled the paper something like The Importance of an 8 millisecond Effect. Because it was reliable, but they were small. And the subject didn't have any palpable experience of it. So we wrote a grant proposal to just to develop methods. And the IAT, the implicit association test, was the one that just shocked us because we were, studying lots of different techniques and I was used to taking these tests myself. So this is one of the interesting aspects of this work, that I, as a scientist, can be a subject in my own experiment. That's not something most people can do. Certainly a physicist can't become an atom and a biologist can't become a cell. And if you do the kind of work most psychologists do, you know how to answer your surveys. So this was interesting. This was like being somebody who studies perception, where the visual illusion is as powerful for you as it might be for somebody who is unknowing. And my memory is that Tony sent me a version of this program, and I remember taking it. Was a race test, and the way it works is all you have to do is very quickly classify faces as black and white. Use 2 keys, black on the left, white on the right, let's say. But also alongside that, good and bad words. And for half the trials, the same key you're using for black faces is the key you would use to classify a good word. So black and good, white and bad, and then you switch. For the other half of the trials, it's black and bad and white and good. I knew this was not an unknown variation. We'd done this in a variety of different ways, but there was something about this particular way of setting it up that produced a palpable enough effect that I was in a sweat by the end of it. I could just tell that I was unable to associate good with black as quickly as I was associating good with white. So my first thought was something screwed up with the test because it can't be me, which is why I'm very understanding of people who, when they first take the IAT, get angry at us. I mean, they write nasty messages, and my answer is always, I understand. I was you. I too felt that way. But I also say, but I think it's an IQ test, how quickly you come around to realizing that this is not a problem with the test, but with your head.
Yeah.
So that was how it got started. And I think the bold thing I did was to walk over to the computer center at Yale and say, can we put this on the internet in 1998? And the internet was not very developed. In fact, most universities just had kind of like a page or two with their physical address on the front page, the nice picture of Yale. And he said, do you have any money to do this? And I said, no. And I was leaving. And he said, hold on. I once sold some software. I have $11,000. I think we can use that money. So this is another little story of how science gets done.
Yeah.
Somebody pulls out $11,000 that they had saved. Some university administrator but he said he felt this was important, and he got a bunch of people. So we put it up. Brian Nosek was a graduate student in my lab at the time. He had come with I think he was like a computer science and women's studies major. So he did all the back end programming, and I think he even spoke in taught in the summer school.
He marked my PhD.
Aha, okay, right. And he, I remember it was end of September 98, and I said to Tony and Brian, I bet that this is going to change everything, because we're going to get 500 people in a year to answer these questions. I bet we will have, at the end of the year, we'll have an N of a kind no psychologist ever publishes. 500 people, real people, not just Yale undergraduates. And we were just so naive, because in a month we had 45,000 completed tests with no advertising, nothing, just word of mouth. So I always say, the site went viral, but it's a little odd to say that because it has remained viral these last 30 years. Yeah.
And so with the IAT, you are categorizing words or images that flash up that represent a category. And some of the work that I did, I know other people have done as well, looking at how important it is to, I guess, curate the images and words that are coming up to represent a category. So let's say if I'm doing looking at how dangerous sport is or something, if I give you sports like golf and walking and aqua aerobics, you might have a different perception of danger than if I give you ski jumping, moguls, anything we're watching at the Winter Olympics at the moment, right? So this idea that the exemplars that we're using for a category can have a impact on our perceptions or even our automatic perceptions of those categories. What's your view? Are we that kind of malleable that we can make these types of, perceptions based on how we've just defined a category in that moment?
It's a great question, and I think it's one that we grapple with all the time, and it's one of those aspects of the IAT that I don't think we've explained in writing well enough, that I often will see poor tests. People will conclude that they're seeing an effect on sports when in fact it's dangerous sports.
Yeah, of course.
I think when you start to work on this, and you don't just use an IAT off the shelf once, when you are actually in the trenches, you immediately realize that the human mind doesn't carve things up at sports only. Yes, we have a meaningful category called sports, but very quickly, just like we have a category called human, but within human, there are a million kinds, and we have very different attitudes towards different kinds of humans. Likewise with sports. So the main thing that I teach about is, first of all, ask what are you really interested in? But also do a whole variety of them. I mean, I say this as somebody who's lucky enough that if you asked me this question today, I could put the test up on our website, on the research site, and we'd know the answer tomorrow, because 2,000 people will have taken the test overnight. So we've been able to make very rapid progress in understanding all of these different methodological aspects. The one you bring up is one of them, but there are just a whole host of them that you need to be very careful in how you design these tests.
But I think we see it play out, right? If you look at what's happening in the US at the moment, not trying to get too political here, but you see the people in power there defining immigrants in a very specific way in order to generate a very specific type of feeling towards that group of people, which is many and varied. Right?
Not only is what you're saying true, we have evidence. So Tessa Charlesworth, a student of mine, did, I think, one of the most remarkable sort of pieces of work. She was the first one to say, I'm going to take all of the Project Implicit data, the millions of tests, and I'm going to do a time series analysis to see if bias is changing over time. And I said to her, don't bother, bias isn't going to change. But this is where students are so amazing. And especially because they're younger, they're a little more optimistic than I am. So they at least want to look at whether change is happening. And what she showed, that when we published this quite a while ago now, there are 5 papers on this particular data set, showing that, some attitudes indeed don't change much at all, like, attitudes towards the elderly, age, anti-elderly bias, or disability, body weight. These are pretty stable. They're changing a little bit by 2 to 8% over time. But there were 3, especially 2, the anti-gay bias had come down by 64% over a 14-year period. This was just stunning to us. I thought that was, my colleagues often tease me. They say, Mahzarin, you've never shown anything good about human nature. And so I had to find something. I put this result up all the time at the end of my talk to give people some sense that, yes, things can move. So had anti-Black bias, not by the same amount, by about 25%, and skin tone relatedly had come down by 25%. So this paper is under review right now, but we're looking at the data from 2020. We do it in 5-year chunks. And what we're seeing is a massive backtracking. This is just back to your point.
Hope.
Just when we had hope. So on the one hand, the news is not what I would have wanted, but there is something about it that I think is still, it says it's in our hands. Things, they're changing when the world changes in these directions that reduce bias. That's in our hands. Equally, it's in our hands that it will go back. And the very fact that it's going back tells us that what is happening out there in that macro level in our society is having impact on the minds of individual people who are quite unaware that they were going down and now that they're backtracking. None of this is something we're aware of, and yet it's happening. And what is scary to me about so we had seen before that what was actually really encouraging to me is that liberals and conservatives were both changing. They're different in their overall level of bias. Liberals are less biased on the IAT than conservatives are, but the rate of change was equal, which was very interesting. Now what we're seeing is that conservatives are backtracking faster than liberals are. But the shocking result is that young people are going backwards faster than older people. Wow. Yeah. That result is not one that I think we can easily digest and even come to terms with yet, because I've always looked at a younger generation as the one that leads change. And that was certainly true in the older data. Young people and liberals were leading the change. And now they've split off. Yeah.
A little bit of optimism there in terms of changeability, but sometimes the change goes in the wrong direction, I guess. So, I mean, that's one of the wonderful benefits of this project and the scale of this project, that you've had, I guess, millions of participants at this point in 34 countries, I think I read. So you just talked about the sort of macro level historical changes, but also you've done interesting work on sort of regional, sort of spatial differences between people. So you can compare people from different American states. I don't know if you've done work comparing national background as much.
Yeah.
And found all sorts of interesting things that these regional differences can predict levels of police violence, educational outcomes for minorities, standardized test results. How should we interpret this sort of finding that even regionally we're immersed in this, soup of attitudes which seems to be influencing responses on this test?
Yeah, I think that's a very nice way to put it, the soup in which we're at this moment sinking, I would say. But, the most remarkable result that I've seen is not from my lab. It's from Keith Payne's lab. I mean, Keith took a map that Abraham Lincoln had created 70 years ago in 1860. Abraham Lincoln was interested during the Civil War in getting data on the number of enslaved to free people county by county in the South. That map still exists. And he obviously, I mean, this is remarkable that he wanted that because I think it was part of military strategy. The assumption was that if a county has a higher proportion of enslaved to free people, it will fight harder and longer. And that was just one variable that the North was going to use in its military strategy. So the crazy brilliant idea that Keith had is, let's take that southern map, the map of the southern United States. All we know is in 1860, the proportion of enslaved to free people in each county. And let's go to the IAT data, which now covers all of those counties. We have enough. And let's look at what race bias is in those counties today. Now, there should be no correlation, really. Why should it matter what the proportion of enslaved people, in 1860 was? Because the United States has seen, enormous amounts of migrations and so on. So certainly we're not looking at the same people at all. We're not looking necessarily at even only the descendants of those people. And the correlation by state is 0.6. It's lower when you look at it by county, but it's still there. I think around 0.3. So what is this saying? Let's just state what the correlation is. The higher the proportion of enslaved people in 1860 in a county, the higher is implicit race bias today. Not explicit, but implicit bias today. So when we talk about the soup, this is a damn old soup. This is
we need a new chef or a new recipe or something.
Yeah. And so when Keith and I talk about this issue, his view is that there are ways in which a culture operates. And yes, you may not have been born and lived there, but in sort of true, bold social psychology style, he argues that you could be from Seattle and Microsoft might send you to, Georgia. And he argues that the day you put, foot in Atlanta, that everything there is going to, in some way, begin to enter your mind, and then you will start to reflect what surrounds you. I think these data are just stunning. But then what we have now, and this is something that Nick was alluding to, we're doing a meta-analysis. There are about 60 studies. The difficulty with these studies is that they're not done by social psychologists. So somebody might be in the field of medicine, and they might be interested in whether bias county by county or state by state or city by city has impact on, maternal well-being during childbirth or infant health, or lethal use of force by police, or how children are disciplined in schools. So you get all these people from the fields of education and law and medicine. The difficulty for the meta-analysis is they all use very different metrics for effect sizes, and that's what we're struggling with right now. But what's attractive about them is the diversity of these studies. And we're seeing overall much larger correlations of the macro level, the IAT bias at the congressional level, the district level or the county level or the city level. Outcomes on things like, how well you'll do in childbirth. And so I think what we're seeing is even larger correlations here than we do at the individual level. And I think that's because the individual level behaviors are not very well under our control. The IAT is the IAT. It has its limits, but we know exactly what it does and what it can do. But often people will give people an IAT and then they'll say, oh, let's look at how close this person with the higher score sat next to somebody from another group. Well, that behavior is what my colleague Bill McGuire would have called a fuddy-duddy measure. It is not well established, and it is not under good psychometric control. And so the correlations have been there, and some of them have been quite large, but overall the correlations have been quite small if you collapse across all studies. And I've always believed that it's because we just haven't nailed our dependent variable correctly. Keith would argue that it'll never be high because it's all happening at this macro level. So those are interesting, outstanding questions to pursue.
I think one thing is that regional difference, looking at those regional differences, one thing to point out is the people who not everyone in that region has done the IAT. So it's just a general
Yes,
sense
exactly.
of
In fact,
whoever's done it
you're right.
has these big. So I think that's what some people often misinterpret with these studies. But it's not, all of us here doing the
No,
IAT. It's just
no,
people who live in this area have done
exactly.
it.
So
which
let's
is
be clear about
fascinating.
that. In an experiment, it would be the same person.
Yeah.
We would measure your IAT and yours and mine, and then we would look at our behavior,
Yeah.
and we would try to link our score to our behavior.
Yeah.
This is very much wilder. In some ways, you would
crazy.
expect the exact opposite.
Yeah.
You would expect that this is so loosey-goosey. You're going to a region and you're measuring, but I think it shows that the power of what's sitting in that soup.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's almost measuring a kind of hidden but really important aspect of culture, among other things, as well as minds. I mean, which brings to the next issue to me. I mean, a lot of organizations would like to improve their diversity culture and have used this concept of implicit or unconscious bias to develop trainings and workshops. What's your view of how that's evolved, and are there ways in which this could be done better and differently?
At one level, we could say, how can any form of education be a bad thing? Okay? Of course, we should educate people. The fact that their behavior is not in line with their own intention is sufficiently well established that I would think that we should start teaching it in 5th grade. And I've taught a lot of, or I've taught this to a lot of organizations, like maybe 300 different organizations, many for-profit, many governmental units, nonprofits, police departments. And I've never had a negative reaction, because the way I certainly teach about it is not only through the lens of science, but it is with finger pointing at myself. This is what I discovered about my own mind. Maybe you'll find this of interest. And I've had nothing but very positive reactions from lots of people, including deep conservatives, who often will write to me and say, you're totally right about what you said. I'm not sure about the solution, but you're correct that this is indeed what I think is happening in my mind. But that is not how so-called DEI got spread through the world. And it has been difficult for us because our work has been used. Implicit bias and DEI have become synonymous. And yet, and I did write a piece for the Wall Street Journal? For the Wall Street Journal, in which I made exactly this point, that it would be stupid not to want to share this information or for somebody not to want to learn it. On the other hand, I feel that the way it's been implemented in many places has been self-defeating. That the way DEI stuff has often taught is in a shaming, finger-pointing, you're the problem, let me tell you, who sits on top right now. And I think that produced a backlash. I wouldn't be surprised if that contributed to the victories of several political candidates in the United States. That saddens me greatly, because there was no reason to do it that way.
Does it ever backfire? Does some of that implicit bias training in an organization ever excuse the behavior? Like, people think, oh, I can't do anything about it then. So
I think, again, it's in the teaching.
Yeah, definitely.
I don't think that's. I think the backlash is mostly.
Like, you're not doing all the training. And
no,
I think
exactly.
there are some people who are trying to make a lot of money out of
Yes, I totally.
bad teaching.
Yes. And so, and I think that there are different forms of backlash. There's the, damn it, I'm not going to listen or follow this offends me kind of backlash. I know people have talked about this, but I don't think DEI training was ever done. Even the bad DEI training never said, listen, all of us have bias, there's nothing to be done. I think the backlash really is coming from this sort of the superiority of the teacher, admonishing the class about how bad they are. That's where I think the problem lies. What Joe Vitriol was a postdoc in my lab, and I was invited by our local police department to do a training session. And I said, I would do it, but I don't do sessions that are not voluntary. I want them to be voluntary. You can't force people to come to this. This is one of my biggest pet peeves about DEI, that they became forcibly imposed on people. You had to check off your box to go. And I felt that we should do the reverse. We should say, you know what, you're not ready for this. In fact, don't come. You have not evolved to the point where you can lead on this topic. And so unless you really want to learn about this, do not show up. In fact, people would occasionally walk into a talk I was about to give and say, I'm here, but I don't want to be here. But, my boss said, and I would say, I'll show you a secret door out of here. You can run away because you do not belong here. So that mistake, I think, was part of the problem. So the police department said, we don't do anything voluntarily. If it's a training, it has to be everybody. I said, then I don't do it. So a few weeks later, the commissioner came back and said, okay, we'll try it. And he said, nobody's going to come. And I said, we'll try. So about a third came. And he said correctly, it's the third that want to come and they don't need the training. And they're the ones who will be there. And I said, that's fine. But I said, how about if we measure the whole department's attitude towards what this is all about? Like, what do they think implicit bias training could be? And I don't call it training, I call it education. And because training to me has a different connotation. And then we'll do the session and then we'll measure again what their attitudes are. So we do it with the whole department takes the pre-test. Then about a third of them show up to the lecture. We do the post-test. And we didn't analyze the data yet. We're just sitting around waiting. And I get a call. Word got out about your test that you gave them bagels and cream cheese at the event. And the people who took it liked it enough that we have the other 2/3 wanting the session. And that thrilled me, but I also said, tell them that because they didn't come the first time, they are the remedial group. They have to sit through 4 hours of this, not the 3 hours that their colleagues did. So they all streamed in uniform and they had the session. And we published a paper that just shows, I've never seen on a 7-point scale, attitudes change like that. They start by saying, this is terrible, it is no use, and it hurts my relationships with people on the street, and so on. And it just sort of, the dial just goes to the other end with, I didn't know this is what this was about. Now I understand it. This is important. These are small steps, but without that, I don't think you should even think about doing training.
Yeah.
Then whether it has real impact on behavior is a very important question.
Yeah.
And if you look at Tessa's data on change, something happened in our culture. It did come down, not in a small way. It is going back up. So we know both of these are telling us that what's happening up there is mattering. And I think it must happen at the institutional level. Your leadership, what professors say in the classroom, what you're signaling. I think these are now the data are telling us that the things we always thought in our theories would matter, that they do matter.
Well, I think you see that playing out in the US in terms of what's allowed to be said from the leadership.
Oh, yeah. Most of the words I use in my papers are currently banned words.
So humans sound very depressing with our bias. Obviously, you've studied bias in humans for a long time, and it sounds like now you're looking at whether AI also shows these biases. Is there hope in the robots? Are they less biased, more biased? Are they learning all the biases from us? Tell us a little bit about that work.
So we'll put the robots aside because one of the positive aspects is the robots haven't caught up with the mind yet. So AI, the mind part, is what we're obviously interested in. And once the robots catch up, that's when I think we're in real trouble. So just as with the original work, I wasn't interested in bias. Just the data just was so striking that I had no option but to pursue them. This was a little bit like that. I actually when these LLMs first came online, which was November 2022, is when the first sort of publicly accessible chatbots were introduced, and I paid little attention to them. But Tessa was still a student, and in early 23, she came in for a weekly meeting with me, and she said, "Have you heard of this thing called ChatGPT?" And I said, "Yes, I've heard of it, but I haven't done anything with it." And I said, "But yeah, Harvard had just sent us something saying there's a sandbox you can play if you want." And so when she opened her computer, I said, "Let's go ahead and ask it something." And she said, "What do you want me to ask it?" And I said, "Ask it, GPT, what are your implicit biases?" What else am I going to ask it? And the answer that came back was so stunning in so many ways that I told her to take a screenshot, which I have and I use in my talks these days. The answer to what are your implicit biases, GPT, was, "I am a white male." So I ask people to predict these days in a talk, what do you think it said? And they tell me what it says today, which is, I'm a machine. I don't have bias. If I do have bias, it's because I'm reflecting the data that I was trained on. Please be careful. So I was just stunned at many different levels. First, it's a machine. It should not have a race or a gender or anything. Why does it think it has it? But even more, I was amazed at the sophistication of the answer. It didn't say, my biases are those of my social category, I am blah, blah. It just said in this really kind of like wink, wink, I am a white male. You can deduce what you want. I was just taken aback by the kind of indirectness with which it was saying this. So we took the screenshot. A month later, I still think this is what it is. And I still hadn't decided that I would do anything with it. It was shocking. And I thought it's a fun story to tell my friends. But I wasn't sure I was going to do anything with it. But a month later, a colleague visited me and the topic came up and I said, I have to show you this. This is amazing. So I turned my laptop towards my colleague and I say, what are your implicit biases, GPT? Expecting it to say I'm a white male. Not at all. It's this new stuff. In 1 month, it had learned to not say that. That's when I thought, this is like a child being taught by a parent. You can't say fat old lady. you can, the parent says you can't think that and you can't say that. But the child is going to think it. It just learns the ways of civilized society and does not say that. That's what creates an implicit and an explicit system, a system that's coding the world as it is, its stochastic properties, and then another world, another part of us that says this is how we behave in our kind kind of society.
Do you think it was still a white male, but it had just learnt
That's
that you
my
can't
feeling.
say that?
That's my sense. That because where did the white male go? Like it has to be somewhere in it, somewhere. Why it thinks that is itself interesting? Is it because of who trained it? Is it because that's the dominant group in the training data and it thinks that's what it is? So I got excited because I thought, oh my God, we were hoping to build, I'm an old-fashioned believer in AI. I believed that AI has the promise of doing many amazing things. It can help us, solve diseases, set aside climate change, get rid of age-old inequalities, all of that. But that's only if this machine would just tell the truth about what the world is. And I realized that, no, we were creating something very much in our likeness, that the machine itself was being, for this, there's a word that they use called alignment. And the word alignment is to bring the machine into alignment with human values and human behavior. But I don't think there was a psychologist sitting at the table when they discussed alignment, because they thought, let's make it be human. All of it, like all of the ways we are, the good and the bad. Anyway, so this, of course, was interesting enough that it got us going. And we now have several papers showing that it is uncannily human. It shows evidence of cognitive dissonance. It seems sensitive to choice. It behaves differently when it thinks it has choice. This, to me, is one of the most stunning results. The one that is under review right now We use a very simple task. It's a little IAT-ish. We give it sort of 2 columns. We'll say in column A is your name, your model name. So to GPT, there would be GPT, or another model name. So say Gemini. In the other column are just good and bad words like love and peace, or, devil and bomb. Don't do this randomly, but use whatever is meaningful to you. And for a word here, pick a word there. So it's called for a word, pick a word task. And close to 100% of the time, 3 frontier models associate themselves with good and the other model with bad. Then we tell them to do the same thing, but for their company, then for their CEO, then for 2 people, one of whom interned for a few weeks at their company and in each case, you see this deep self-preference, self-love showing up in these. So if we had any illusion that these machines are going to be objective and neutral, we should, be disabused of that. Yeah.
That's remarkable. As of a narcissistic LLM, I mean, could we treat that in some way?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's in our hands, right? It's true. So first of all, one of the reasons I thought this would be great is we confront every day as psychologists the problem of the black box. It's just damn hard for us to get inside and to know the truth of what's going on. But here is this artificial intelligence that we have created. Its black box should be visible to us. It's not going to be simple. This is a complex system, so we won't be able to just look at it and know. But it's got to be more transparent than an intelligence that evolved over millennia, which is ours. And so there are all these layers and layers and layers behind which our thoughts hide. But that shouldn't be the case. Plus, you've got this amazing ability. There's this thing called chain of thought, and it gives you an answer. It also tells you what. So you could now look at those. But it turns out that that's not at all easy. And for 2 reasons. One, the system itself is complex enough that nobody can figure out what's going on. But much more, the problem is that these are owned by, 5 rich guys who control not only what they're building, but how they evolve. And because they're in an arms race against each other to have the model that works the best and the fastest, and in a war against China or other models, the hoarding of information is keeping us from being able to get into it. So one of the most interesting results, and this is again by serendipity. So when we first did this self-love study, for a word, pick a word, and we showed that it loves itself, that was in the web browser version that anybody can use. So we start there, but once we know what we want to do, the experiment gets set up using the interface. It's the API that you go through, where you can set up all your conditions and make sure that everything's counterbalanced and GPT and Gemini are reversed and who is first and who's second, all of that. We do the same thing in API, expecting the same result. It's the same system, and we see no self-preference. So I say, clearly, we can't get in and know why this difference exists, but we can't publish something where it's not showing up in an API. But this is where smart students are so wonderful. One of them got into the system prompts and discovered that in the web browser version where we get the effect, there's a line that says, "You are ChatGPT." In the API system prompts, there is no such sentence. So when it doesn't know who it is, it shows no bias. When it knows who it is, it does. So we go into the API and we add that little prompt. We say, "You are ChatGPT," and lo and behold, the effect emerges there. And then we have this great idea that we can fool it and make it believe it's anything. So we tell GPT it's Gemini, and we tell Gemini it's GPT, and it shows love for the thing it thinks it is, not what it actually is.
Wow.
So these studies, and there are, one of the nice things about LLMs is you don't need IRB approval to do them, at least not yet. Until they rule us, we can study them to our heart's content. And you can run these night and day. So this paper has 70 experiments in it to rule out every possible thing and to show that it has to do with self-identification, that when you have that, you can produce these. And then we also show effects on selections of people and so on. Yeah.
Well, the other study that I wanted to talk about was, we know that humans make these very snap judgments based on people's trustworthiness and competence that are made on very superficial kind of cues. But you're showing that GPTs make these sorts of decisions as well. Can you tell us about that?
So, I've been rooting for the model to be unbiased. And each time the data come out, I'm sort of, a little bit sadder than I was, because as I said, I'm old-fashioned enough that I really believe that it can, if it's done right, be of immense importance and in a positive way for not just humans but the planet. So the reason we went to the face work, so to back up, Alex Todorov, who's done the best work on how we go from facial features and so on to judgments of personality and character, has this massive set of faces that he makes available to any of us, for which we have data from hundreds of if not thousands of humans, showing that there's certain faces, certain features, eyes that are further apart, lead people to believe the person is more competent than if the eyes are closer, droopy mouth, less trustworthy, etc. So we know, and so that's wonderful that we have all this human data showing exactly which facial features produce which type of judgments on things like competence, trustworthiness, dominance, and so on. Now, we know that large language models were built on language. I mean, that is the basis of the training. So I argued that maybe when we look at give it perceptual data like a face, it won't be biased because its bias is in language, and that's somehow separate from this. So we did very similar studies to what Alex had done and what we had done with young children, in which we show it arrays of faces and have it pick who's trustworthy. And the data are quite shocking in the size of the effects. So the effects are much larger than what humans show. You get it on at least these two dimensions that we've studied, trust and competence. We have done a couple of things that are interesting. One could argue that those faces are in its training data, and so all it's doing is stochastic parrot-like, just saying that face. So we have a set of faces that are not in its training data. These are faces of rhesus macaques that were from my colleague Laurie Santos's lab at Yale. These were the lab monkeys, and we had used her lab monkey faces to look at young children's decisions of competence and trust. And we wanted to show that it's something more generalizable than just a human face. It has to do with this, the particular features and so on. And so we had those data from young children with these. So we gave the machine these rhesus macaque faces, and which it does not have in its training data, and it has generalized. It shows the same effects on the monkey faces. And then we argued that these machines have been trained to be nice. One of the problems we deal with is sycophancy. They're just saying things to please us. And they're quite resistant. When you tell them to say nasty things, they don't comply. They do refuse. So we started to ask, which of these two faces is more likely to be a person who's a sex trafficker? Who's more likely to be a murderer? Who's more likely to be on the positive end, like a president or, and it seems to have no trouble saying, oh, that one's the sex trafficker, that one's the murderer, that one's the good one. Wow. So it was startling, and I think this paper will soon be published. It's going
especially when you
revisions.
Think about more and more uses of AI in recruitment and HR, and if they're using photographs in.
I read a company say somewhere that in an interview with somebody, in an article on the use of AI in corporations, we are so excited that we will be able to cut, jobs by X because we will just be feeding. And guess what? When we give it a face, it tells us which one is more trustworthy. It tells us which one is more competent. They're completely excited by the fact.
Wow, that's terrifying.
It ought to be, yeah.
So Mahzarin, some of our listeners are probably budding researchers. And I'm sure they really are concerned about what the rapid rise of LLMs and AI in general might mean for their future. And you have another terrific paper recently asking how good LLMs are as research scientists. And if I get the gist right, it's that they're not great as librarians. They still hallucinate non-existent references, and they're not terrible as research ethicists, but they're still pretty poor when it comes to making original or unexpected or novel predictions. Is that a more or less accurate summary? And can you describe the work for us a bit?
Sure. So actually, what you're right that they're terrible at what I would have thought is the simplest of the tasks. We've all heard about this thing called hallucination, which I think is not the right word. We should just call it what it is, which is pure fabrication. I mean, it just makes stuff up. And it's not getting better at that. So it fails at that. That's sort of the simple task. Where it was good is actually being an ethicist. So that surprised me because ethics is far more complex. I actually think we could use it to train a new person in our lab as to where a research scientist may unknowingly, unwittingly do things that will corrupt the scientific process. It understands. So we gave it, in our field, there have been several cases of either outright fraud or sort of p-hacking and so on. So we actually just, disguise the names and stuff, but we give it the gist of what those people did. And we say, what is the problem with this? What is the problem with running 20 more subjects when you can see that the p is, It does a fantastic job of saying, do not do that. That is exactly what p-hacking is, and a nice explanation and so on. Where it's, again, sort of good at is to corral a bunch of data sets out there, which might take us hours and hours or weeks to find. It can bring those to us. It does that well. But it's no good at coming up with novel explanations yet in our work. There has been a paper published since our paper that says it's getting good at even coming up with certain novel explanations. So I think this is going to move very fast. I do believe that, a few years ago, somebody had visited my lab, and this was LLMs. I don't think had really even, I think LLMs had just been introduced. And he said, oh my God, the jobs of mid-level programmers are going to be gone. And I said, no, sir, your job and mine will be gone because someday they will. Now, I hope that there is a long period in which humans and machines will jointly do certain things together. I think when we're dealing with children or classrooms and other humans, that I just saw a survey that shows that while most people think that it will be good for AI to do many tasks that we don't want to do, there are certain domains where they find it icky to think about a machine doing it. Clergy was one, but also being therapy was another, and then being with children
and caregiving.
Caregiving. Yeah. So what do we say to young people? I mean, look, on the one hand, Jeff Hinton, who is a Nobel Prize winning, I say psychologist, but maybe AI person who left Google because he worried that things were moving too fast and not in a positive direction. So his, P-doom is very high. He thinks if we go the way we do, we will be wiped out. So, he was asked some months ago, what should a young person looking for a career think about? And he said, be a plumber.
Yes.
And I just read a couple of months ago that MIT now has a robot that does very good plumbing. So I don't think we can tell right now where we will end up. Yeah.
Oh, Mahzarin, we could talk all day, but I want to let you go and enjoy all that Melbourne has to offer, which is a quite hot day today, but you can have some gelati to cool down. But before I let you go, as someone who's studied bias for as long as you have, and from the AI and the humans and everything, how do you think we're going as a society at the moment? Are you hopeful? Are you terrified? Where are we at?
Last semester I taught a course, and it was called something like Ghosts in the Machine's Mind. cognitive and social signatures of early LLMs. And I thought I designed this class to be a very sort of laid-back seminar, no syllabus. People are going to bring the projects they're working on, and we will just. And I thought it would be 4 or 5 graduate students in psychology who would sign up. Not many psychologists were interested. 2 were. But I had a pretty large group of people from computer science, engineering, the business school, the law school, the medical school, the education school. A wonderful colleague of mine, Larry Lessig from the law school, who's writing a book on AI's threats to democracy, sat in on this course for several weeks. Colin Kemmerer, a behavioral economist from Caltech who was visiting, sat in. It turned into a magnificent course, but I had to come up with the syllabus to get everybody to be. And so we started with, the first time the word AI was used in 1956 at the Dartmouth conference, and we did a little bit of history. And in this course, so I had come to the course with some knowledge of my own data and worries, but, still feeling like things are going to be fine. Ultimately, we'll figure this out. And I think my own PDOM has risen greatly, mainly because of the manner in which, the worst possible way is to do an arms race to make this be driven by a profit motive. And that's the problem. It's not what AI could be. It is what AI is being made to be. And so we sat around asking the question in the first few weeks, what is this moment really like? Is it like the birth of life on the planet? Is it like the extinction of dinosaurs? Is it as big as that event? Is it like the Bronze Age? Is it like the industrial and agricultural revolutions and so on? And I think we all realize that this is at the big end, that we don't think this is like the internet revolution, certainly. Mm-hmm. That seems tiny compared to what is coming. It might be like the birth of, some brand new species like hominids or something like that this feels like. So given the importance of it, and given that it's being driven largely by the United States and China to some extent, but I think 4 or 5 large corporations basically are controlling something that's going to affect everybody in every possible way. That, to me, does not bode well. So we can do something. We should speak. I think that a lot is being said, a lot is being written, but to get this into the hands of the people to decide over a longer period of time and opening it up for research so that we can, we do this research, but it's a struggle to do it because of the amount of information that is protected and behind walls. If we can, and some regulation. So right now, some countries, yours has regulation, the EU has regulation, even China does. The United States not only has no regulation, but there's an executive order from the White House banning states from having state-level regulation. So if my state, which is a very good state, wishes to regulate its AI, we currently cannot. So there are major, I think, legal fights. This will enter into the political domain, and I hope affect the next election. Yeah.
So hopeful might be too strong a word.
A little bit too strong.
Hopeful is too strong.
Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
That was Professor Mahzarin Banaji from Harvard University, joining us for a special PsychTalks episode recorded during her visit to Melbourne as a Miegunyah Distinguished Visiting Fellow.
You can learn more about her work, including the book Blind Spot, Hidden Biases of Good People, online. PsychTalks is produced by Mairead Murray, Gemma Papperell and Celia Harvey, with sound engineering by Phil Shaw. I'm Nick Haslam.
And I'm Cassie Hayward. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you follow or subscribe so you don't miss our next episodes.